Thank you all for braving the elements and coming out here tonight. You filled the room, and that is no small task, given what's happening out there. Unbelievably, I have been at this running for governor since mid-September, and we made it through the whole winter without a canceled campaign stop until this past weekend. I was supposed to be in Wauwatosa and couldn't get there because of the snowstorm, and then I was supposed to be in Plymouth on Sunday morning, couldn't get there either. So we get to mid-April, and then we start having to cancel stops because of the winter weather. This is nuts. But it means a lot to me that you would come out despite the storm and give me a chance to say a few words about why I'm running for governor and give you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from and what's in my heart. And soon enough, we'll just turn it into a two-way conversation, and you can have at me. But let me start by just saying a few words about my background and what brings me to this place. I'm actually the one and only candidate in the field, and it's a big field, who was born and raised on a farm. And that's actually important because we are not going to get a new governor, and we are not going to move Wisconsin in a different direction by only winning in places like Milwaukee and Madison. We have to be able to compete and compete successfully in places all across this state, places that used to vote for Democrats but stopped. And I'm from one of those places. I grew up on my family's dairy farm in Clark County, about halfway between Eau Claire and Wauwatosa. Outside, about 5 miles north of a little town named Curtis, population 212. It was more like 150 people in my youth. Curtis had the distinction in the last election for governor of giving Scott Walker his biggest percentage margin of victory of any community in the state of Wisconsin. Walker won Curtis with 90% of the vote. And that area, Clark County, was represented solidly by Democrats when I was young. So I've watched my own neighbors take this journey, go through this evolution, moving from being represented by Democrats to voting overwhelmingly Republican. I get where they're coming from. I understand their anger and their feelings that they've been written off and are looked down upon or forgotten. And my feeling and a big motivation for me in running for governor is that there are just too many forgotten people living in forgotten places. And some of those people are in the inner city right here, and some of those people live way out in the middle of nowhere, like where I'm from. Now, I've had the opportunity to live both in the city and in the country. I've straddled both worlds. And the thing that fascinates me is for all of the talk about how we are so divided, rural versus urban. So much is made of that urban-rural divide. And it's assumed that we have very little in common and that we should be at each other's throats. What always fascinates me is how much in common the people in places like Curtis actually have with people in places like Milwaukee. And all I know is that Wisconsin cannot be successful if our largest city is unsuccessful. Wisconsin cannot be the state it has the potential to be if Milwaukee fails. So it is in the interest of everybody, from places like Curtis to anywhere else in Wisconsin, it is essential that we do everything in our power to make sure that Milwaukee can thrive. But at the same time, we have to be able to reach out to people who feel forgotten in other parts of the state, who then have chosen to lash out. And I have traveled over 60,000 miles now since September 12th, since I announced my candidacy. You can't put on 60,000 miles by simply making trips between Milwaukee and Madison. I've gone to every nook and cranny of this state. And there are so many people out there. I have run into so many Trump voters. And I can tell you this, there are no two alike. They all have their reasons for having lashed out in the way that they did. But I think the thing that they all have in common is that they were feeling forgotten and ignored and overlooked and looked down upon. They chose to reach for a Molotov cocktail that they could hurl at the political establishment. And you have to admit, Donald Trump is a big honking Molotov cocktail. I get their frustration. I don't share their conclusions. I don't share the decisions they made, but I understand what's underneath it. And that's a political system that caters ceaselessly to those at the very top and ignores the wishes and the needs of most of the rest of the population. And that brings me to my second reason for running. It's not just about where I'm from, but it's about my life's work. Almost all of my adult life has been spent as an independent watchdog, working to expose and break the grip of big money influence in politics. I helped start a group called the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign that shined light on the transactions between wealthy donors and elected officials. All of that work showed me that we have a system that on every single issue that we care about, every single concern of ours is affected by those transactions between wealthy donors and elected officials. And I can really sum it up as simply as this. Any one of you here tonight, any one of you sitting here, could pull out a checkbook right now and write out a check for $20,000 and hand it to me as a candidate for governor. And that would be a perfectly legal transaction. I won't take that check if you even had the habit of writing such checks. But here's what I've learned after all those years of doing the work that I've done. It's enabled me to have a hunch that those of you here tonight have not had the habit of writing such checks and handing them to candidates for office. In fact, it's a tiny, tiny segment of our society that does have that habit. And those people who have that habit and make those legal bribes, and that's what they are, let's be honest, that's what they are. They are legal bribes. Those checks come with strings attached. Those checks are accompanied by certain expectations. And everything that I've experienced in watching how the people's business is done at the Capitol has shown me that what those wealthy donors want our government to do is radically different from what you all want our government to do. And they get our government to do as they wish on issue after issue after issue. We have to challenge that crooked system. We have to break free of the stranglehold that money has over our political system. That is a huge motivation for me in running for governor. I cannot in good conscience take those $20,000 checks from wealthy individuals or $86,000 checks that can be written by political action committees. I see them for what they are. They are legal bribes, and they end up putting government under the ownership of a privileged few at the very top. I'm going to run this campaign. I've done it so far, and I'm still standing, but I'm going to run this campaign all the way to the finish line and not take any single donation over $200. And that creates a challenge. That means that this campaign has got to be people-powered and crowd-funded. It's got to be a whole bunch of people being willing to give small amounts of money and give of their time and their energy. This is going to have to be neighbor talking to neighbor. And the amazing thing, everywhere I've gone in this state, the response has been extraordinarily positive. It has vastly surpassed my expectations. And people have come out of the woodwork. We've got over 2,100 volunteers across the state for this campaign. And it is inspiring to see so many people wanting to take matters into their own hands, to try to get their democracy back in their possession. And that's what it's going to take. So that's a huge motivation for me in choosing to make this run. This is not a path that I have pursued over the course of my life. I have not spent my life running for or holding office, but we are living at a moment of crisis, a dangerous moment, And all of us are going to have to think about what we can do to push ourselves out of our comfort zones, think outside of the boxes that we've been in for too long. And that goes for me too. I had to look in the mirror and say, what more can I do to help Wisconsin get back on the right track? And so let me finish by giving you a glimpse into the Wisconsin I want to live in. And you can judge for yourself if it's the kind of state that you also want to see. But the Wisconsin I want to live in is a state that seeks to erase the words working poor from our vocabulary. I want this state to have an economy where if you work, you're in the middle class. And I know the governor's going around the state saying that unemployment is low and the economy is healthy. And I'll tell you this, most people can find work out there. I know a lot of people who've got 2 or 3 jobs. But what people are finding so difficult is to find work that actually keeps them in the middle class. Because here we are today in Wisconsin. So far in the 21st century, no state in America has seen its middle class shrink more than Wisconsin. We have levels of economic inequality now in Wisconsin not seen in our state since the Great Depression. We are dead last in the nation in new business startups for 3 straight years. This used to be an industrial powerhouse, and our state is becoming a shadow of its former self. And to change that reality, we have to do an about-face in the whole philosophy of how we create opportunity and build a sturdy economy. We have to do a complete about-face. For decades now, Wisconsin's strategy has been about feeding the rich, trying to build that sturdy economy from the top down, showering tax breaks and state subsidies on a few thousand people, or a few huge corporations, or one global conglomerate from Taiwan, and hope that some of that would filter down to the rest of us, that they would work some magic for the rest of the population. No, we have to do the exact opposite and build that sturdy economy and that opportunity from the bottom up. I call it geyser economics, because economic prosperity gushes up and it does not trickle down. That means we have to invest our resources in empowering 6 million people in this state to do more for themselves and for each other. That means a living wage for every worker. It means health care for all. It means debt-free education for everyone. It means high-speed internet everywhere. Those investments are the way to create opportunity and a healthy economy for all of us, and not just the privileged few at the top. That's the Wisconsin I want to live in. I want Wisconsin to be a state that aims to be the first state in America fully powered by renewable energy. And we are not even making a half-hearted attempt to compete in that race currently. But I'll tell you this, that is not only the right thing to do for our land and our air and our water, it is the right thing to do for our economy. Because if Wisconsin were just doing as well as our Great Lakes neighbors, if we were just at the region average for producing green energy jobs, we would have 30,000 more people employed in the clean energy sector than we do today. This is something that can create a bright future for Wisconsin. I want Wisconsin to seriously compete to be the first state in the nation fully powered by renewable energy. That means putting our government on the side of the energy revolution. I want Wisconsin to be a place where if you turn on a water faucet, you are not afraid to drink what comes out. I want Wisconsin to be a place where nobody anywhere is afraid to drink the water. And whether it's in Milwaukee with lead in the water, or Lake Mills, which similarly has a lead pipe problem, or places like rural Kewaunee or Calumet County, where they turn on a water faucet and what comes out is brown and smells like cow manure, that condition should not exist anywhere in our state. And we have to put our government back on the side of protecting the land, the air, the water, our people. And that means a pressing need for a change in leadership in our government. And that leads me to the final thought I want to share with you. Because that vision of what Wisconsin has the potential to become, making Wisconsin reach that potential is not possible unless we do one other thing, and that is cut out the cancer that is growing in the body of our democracy. We have allowed cronyism and corruption and legal bribery to take root in our state, and we have to uproot it. We will never get clean air and clean water from dirty politics. We will never get good health care from a sick political system. We will never get living wages from a dying democracy. We will never get more than thoughts and prayers after each new mass shooting, as long as elected officials are paid to take no other action. We have to deal with the underlying cause of a government that will not listen to us and will not act on our behalf. And that has to do with those transactions, with those checks, with strings attached. I can't in good conscience take them. That means we need to create a people-powered movement to take on those forces of big money and defeat them. And when we do that, then we can create the Wisconsin that we want. Let me just share one last thought as a candidate in the Democratic primary for governor. When you think of the conditions we face today, there are so many people dealing with trauma, dealing with tough times. When you think back to a time in American history when trauma visited our country in a major way, back at the time of my parents' youth, my dad was born in 1919, my mom in 1921. They lived through the Great Depression. And as the country plunged into the Great Depression, as it descended into economic trauma, the greatest president the Democratic Party ever produced told the American people, the forces of organized money are unanimous in their hatred for me, and I welcome their hatred. We have to revive that spirit in our time. I am running for governor to do everything in my power to revive that spirit in our day. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you. Your turn. I said we'd turn it into a two-way conversation. You're up. Have at me. Questions, comments? Yes. No. But I did. I've actually never been a member of any political party. I am running as a Democrat. A long time ago, in the very early 80s, I worked as an aide to 3 Republican members of the Assembly. So I do have experience having worked with Republicans and Democrats over the years. I also once worked on Russ Feingold's very first campaign for U.S. Senate. But I've never been a member of any major party, and I did work for decades that actually put me in a position of calling out Democrats and Republicans whenever I saw wrongdoing or unethical conduct. And I make no apologies for that work. I am proud of it. That work at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, calling out the effects of those transactions I described, that's work that we have to do. But no, I have never been a Republican. Other questions or comments?
I have a question.
Yes. Yes, Gloria.
Like you said, one of the things that has been forgotten is the inner city.
Yes.
My thing is, what could we do to try to bring the inner city into, how can I put this? Trying to get them more involved in a lot of the stuff that's going on in the community.
Yeah.
How would you, because I know Scout Walker don't care. I wrote a letter to get contribution programs put back into LPS, and he said that the funding, there was no funding for that.
Right.
But how, for those who have been forgotten in the inner city, how would you help the inner city?
Well, you know, when Governor Walker says there's no funding available for inner city renewal or revival, when there's no money available to invest in empowering people living in inner city neighborhoods, he then turns around and says Wisconsin can afford to give $4.5 billion to subsidize the expansion of a Taiwanese conglomerate. So it's just a matter of priorities. It's a matter of saying in our budget, what do we think is important to invest in? A foreign corporation or regular working people? And so part of it is just changing the mindset in our government and thinking about investing in the empowerment of people from the bottom up rather than trying to manufacture prosperity from the top down. That's a fundamental philosophical shift that has to happen. But there's no one answer to urban renewal or revival. But I'll tell you one thing that has to happen is we have to come to terms with the effects of mass incarceration. Look, right across the border to the west, Minnesota imprisons half as many people as Wisconsin. And yet our two states have virtually identical crime rates. So imprisoning twice as many people here hasn't reduced crime. It has simply led us to the point where we have a state budget that spends more on prisons than the entire university system. That's a tragic reality in Wisconsin. We spend more locking people up than we do on unlocking human potential. And the only way I know how to reverse those budget priorities is to deal with the root causes of that mass incarceration. And it starts with the fact that first of all, we've dealt with mental health issues through our prison system. And we should deal with mental health issues outside of the prison system in mental health facilities and in hospitals and in clinics. And we have drug laws that a second marijuana possession charge, for example, is a felony. Those laws have been applied in a very racially discriminatory way. If you get a second marijuana possession charge in an awful lot of zip codes in Wisconsin, you don't go to prison. You get a second marijuana possession charge in 53206, the most heavily incarcerated zip code in America, and you do go to prison. And Minnesota has used a very different approach, an alternative approaches to sentencing. They simply don't lock up nonviolent offenders the way Wisconsin does. We've got to get to the point where we stop locking up nonviolent offenders and we use alternative sentencing approaches. And then they invest way more heavily in mental health and drug treatment rather than using the prison system to punish those who have those challenges. So we've taken a lock them up and throw away the key approach. Minnesota has taken a vastly different approach. They imprison half as many people, which frees them to invest in the empowerment of people through education and health services, and we instead spend more of our budget locking people up. That's the kind of thing that also has to change. And boy, I could list a long list of things that we need to do and can do to help create urban renewal. But I gotta say this: transportation is a huge issue. And what a horrible mistake Wisconsin made, turning away $800 million in federal money that could have gone to start us down the road toward high-speed rail all across our state. And the only thing I can figure, I saw the oil industry contributions flowing in, and they wanted to keep people in cars burning gasoline. They didn't want people riding trains. And then the other thing is people didn't want folks leaving their inner city neighborhoods and going out to the suburbs. And you know, we've got to deal with those realities. And it was such a missed opportunity. We should never squander that kind of opportunity again. We should commit ourselves to enabling people, empowering people to go where good paying employment can be found. We should invest in job creation in local communities. We should deal with the underlying causes of mass incarceration so we don't constantly fracture families. We do all of those things, and we create living wages and access to affordable health care. All of those steps can empower any inner city residents to thrive, just as they are also empowering people in rural areas to do much better than they currently are as they struggle economically. So this is a message that we have to take to every part of Wisconsin, every part of our state. It really does involve a change in philosophy. Instead of feeding the rich, we've got to invest in the empowerment of regular working people. Other questions, comments? Gloria, I actually should add one more thing, because mass incarceration is one of the legs that the new Jim Crow stands on. But another key leg is voter suppression policies. We've got to address that too. There has been a very active effort to make it more difficult for certain populations to participate in our democracy. The way district boundaries are drawn, the way voter suppression policies are put in place, like voter ID. At the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, I spent decades trying to work against those kinds of policies and then work for their repeal once they were put in place. As governor, that is going to be a huge emphasis of mine, is making voting easier, not more difficult, bringing down the barriers to participation in our democracy, because that is how people in inner city neighborhoods or rural communities alike can gain power and can gain a voice. And that is being made much, much harder. So I have to add that as well. That is one of the legs of the new Jim Crow that we have to cut out from under that whole idea. Yes?
Mike, would you support automatic voter registration for people when they turn 18?
Yes.
It's been supported like West Virginia, which is not exactly a blue state, all the way to the Pacific West.
Yes, I've called for that for years. Yeah, just asked if I would support automatic voter registration. The technology exists. The data is there for all of us, for people to be automatically signed up to be registered to vote without having to take the step of finding a ride down to a polling station or the clerk's office. Not only should we reduce barriers by getting rid of voter suppression policies, but we should actually take steps like that, like automatic voter registration, to bring us truly into the 21st century and make participation easier for people. And the information exists, the capacity to do this already exists. The only thing that is missing is the political will, and that's what has to be supplied. Yes? Yeah. Of course we should. Of course we should. And the only reason that we are resisting making voting easier is because those who currently are in control of the Capitol have figured out that this is a way for them to stay in power even if they are no longer in favor with the public. That if they draw district lines in certain ways, if they draw political boundaries in certain ways, they can actually win fewer votes but still capture more seats. And that's happened in the last several elections. Those who currently are in control at the Capitol won fewer votes than their opponents statewide. If you look at all the votes in all the congressional and legislative districts, Republicans won fewer votes, but they won more seats. And that's because of the way they drew the boundaries. They packed lots of Democratic voters into very few districts and dispersed Democratic voting power very broadly across the rest of the state. And then they put in place voter suppression policies that inhibit participation by some of the most vulnerable populations in our state that so happen to have the habit of voting more regularly Democratic. What they're trying to do is cement in place their grip on power, even if they fall out of favor with the voting public. That's why they're doing these things. It has to be acknowledged as such, and then we have to dismantle those kinds of barriers to participation. We should have a system where people are automatically registered to vote and can exercise that right without obstruction. In a country that claims to be the world's greatest democracy, settling for anything less than that is ridiculous. And that's a spirit that has to be brought back to the state capitol. It's a huge reason, because of my life's work, it's a huge reason that I'm even pursuing this path of running for governor. Yeah. Right. Indeed. Yep. Yep. And I have to say that you can go to a lot of places in cities in Wisconsin and find dead zones as well where there's not even access to internet, much less affordable internet. But so this is not just a rural problem, it can be an urban problem as well. But, you know, I am well aware of the reality, having grown up where I did, I'm well aware of the reality that half of rural Americans don't have access to high-speed internet, and Wisconsin is not an exception to that national rule. And how on earth, whether you're in the inner city in a dead zone or out in the country in a dead zone, how on earth do you fully participate in a 21st century economy or even fully participate in modern American life without that basic necessity? This is a basic necessity in this century. And we have to make sure that it is available to everybody, and that means making sure that it's there for people and it's affordable as well. Now, I think a big key to this is being willing to stop with the subsidies and the feed the rich policies and use our resources instead on these very kinds of investments. Now, the people who are expert in this field say that it would cost about $1 billion in Wisconsin to bring high-speed internet to every part of our state. So what I've said is let's have a plan to do this in 5 years, $200 million investment in each one of 5 years until it's done. But I would pay for that investment not only by rerouting funding that now is feeding the rich and using it for this kind of investment, but I would do one other thing. What the state has done is they have put in place these laws that prevent anyone but private telecoms from providing access to internet service. I say open the doors. Let cities, towns, villages, counties provide this for their communities. Let nonprofit enterprises like BadgerNet or WhiskNet do this on a not-for-profit basis. Let rural cooperatives be involved in bringing high-speed internet access to their communities and providing that service. That has currently been prevented by state preemption laws that have been put in place at the request of the AT&Ts and the Comcasts of the world that don't want anyone but the private telecoms to have any involvement in providing internet service. So we've got to be willing to say, let's have all hands on deck. The nonprofits, the telecoms, the municipalities, the rural cooperatives, let's have all of them in a position of being able to take that funding, make the internet access available, and then provide it at a reasonable cost to consumers. We open the doors wide to these other participants. That will result in bringing the cost down and make it more affordable to people like you. But it does require the ability and the willingness to stand up to those wealthy interests that currently have a stranglehold on our state's political leadership. They paid good money to get those preemption laws. Yeah. Currently in Wisconsin, we have a law that says you have to be off paper in order to vote. So if you're convicted of a felony and you do time, when you get out and re-enter the community, you can be out there working and paying taxes and helping to raise your family, but still not be eligible to vote because you haven't completed all of the conditions of probation or parole. I have pushed for felon re-enfranchisement for decades when I was at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. To me, if somebody has done their time and paid their debt to society, they should be voting. They should be eligible to vote. If they're out in the community and they're paying taxes and they're working, they should be voters. So Wisconsin has some pretty backward laws in that respect. There are states that are even worse than Wisconsin. I do have to say, there are states where felon voting rights are never restored. Once convicted of a felony, you never get to vote again. Wisconsin, you can get your rights restored, but not until you're completely off paper. I think that's a backward approach. It's a backward law. We should say, if you're out there in your community and you're out there working and paying taxes and helping to support your family and all that, you're a voter. You have a right to choose your representation. So that's something that, well, you know, and with the democracy campaign, right, 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 yeah. Oh, I'm fine with taking that step as well. A good first step would simply be to say that you don't have to wait until you're off paper. But having people eligible to vote while incarcerated is okay with me too. And that's something that I've... And see, that's the thing that we have to restore, is that sense that we're citizens. We have a duty to participate in our democracy, choose our representation, and decide the direction of our country. We need to restore that concept. What we've got now is political leadership that has taken us in the direction of saying we want fewer people to have that ability to have a say. We want to concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands. That's been a process that's been playing out over a very long time. Well, you know, we've got to start taking steps that move it in the opposite direction. And I'm willing to do it a step at a time. I'm willing to do it all at once if if there are enough elected officials willing to join me. But we've got to move it in the opposite direction, because now we've got a situation where they're saying, let's make it harder for people to participate in our democracy. Let's concentrate more power in fewer hands. Let's have fewer people with a say over what happens in our society. We've got to turn that around, do a complete about-face there as well, and restore this notion that we are all citizens. We all have a civic duty to participate in our government and to choose our representation and our leadership. We all have a voice in our society. That's the direction we have to head, and we have to keep taking steps in that direction. But we've been going in the opposite direction for a disturbing number of years now. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, but I have to say I have a somewhat different vantage point. There are people living in areas like where I grew up who did resent the DNR, and you know, you'd hear people talk about how DNR stood for darn near Russia and all that kind of stuff. And there were people who felt like they should be able to do as they please with their land. But I do have to say that they are not only aware that what runs off of those fields goes downstream and affects people miles and miles away from them, they also realize that what runs off goes into their own private wells and renders them undrinkable. And there are increasing numbers of people living in rural communities who can't drink their own water, and they don't have city water systems. They have private wells. And when those wells are contaminated, they have no water supply. And there is a crisis out there across Wisconsin where more and more people simply can't turn on a water faucet and trust that what comes out is drinkable. In places like Kewaunee County, it really has reached a point where I think that county is virtually becoming uninhabitable because of the massive scale industrialization of agriculture there. It breaks my heart to see agriculture evolve in this direction, coming from a small family dairy farm. There are people who want to sell and leave, but nobody will buy their property and come in because nobody wants to move in there, so they're trapped. And they're up in arms about this. So I think the reason that rural people have skewed Republican in recent years is way more complicated than issues of the environment. I think the biggest thing is that they just feel that it's been a very long time since government even recognized that they were out there, and they don't feel that government has done anything to make their lives better for a very long time. They feel very ignored and overlooked. They don't feel they're getting their fair share of taxes that they pay, and that makes them much more prone to vote for the anti-government party. Here's the dilemma for Democrats. The more government is seen as fouled up, the easier it is for Republicans to win elections. Even when Republicans are in power, if they foul up the government, it actually makes it easier for them to win elections because people default to the anti-government party, and which party has branded itself as the party of less government and lower taxes. So that's the dilemma for Democrats. We have to make people in areas like that a much better offer than they've been made for a very long time. There were powerful reasons why my parents were lifelong Democratic voters. They were old enough to remember rural electrification. They were old enough to remember power lines strung down every back road to every barn and every farmhouse. It revolutionized the rural economy and rural life. They were old enough to remember the creation of Social Security that created retirement security for everyone. My dad fought in World War II, and the GI Bill was waiting for every soldier who came home. And think about this. What has been done by our government any time in recent decades that is had the equivalent impact of rural electrification on rural America, or the equivalent impact of Social Security or the GI Bill? People out there have noticed this, that they don't seem to be getting anything, and so they vote anti-government. We can do something about that. Yeah, let's take high-speed internet down every back road. Let's make it available everywhere. Let's create real opportunity for people in those areas. There's a way out of this trap, but we've got to think big if we're gonna overcome the dilemma that Democrats face, where a fouled up government actually makes it easier for Republicans to win elections. Yes. To me, there's a problem with policing philosophy all across the country, in Milwaukee and all across our country. The motto "Protect and Serve" used to be plastered on just about every police vehicle all across the country. That philosophy, that motto, "Protect and Serve," was the reflection of what policing was supposed to be. Well, that protect and serve motto has really morphed into intimidate and control. That's the new philosophy of policing. We've got to get back to protect and serve. We've got to set a tone from the governor's office on down that policing is about protecting and serving communities. It is not about intimidating and controlling populations. That is a mindset shift that has to be made if we're going to seriously do anything over the long haul about police brutality. But if you make that shift in your mindset, then you start dealing with acts of police brutality very differently. You hold the perpetrators of police brutality far more accountable. If you begin to establish a standard that the role of policing is to protect and serve rather than to intimidate and control. So it really is another one of those areas where as a society we need to do an about face.
How do you bring that about?
Well, I think you start with leadership from the top, but it's also about engaging people in communities, about making that shift in our mindset. But a governor has the ability to use the bully pulpit of the office to raise these issues and to talk about them loud and clear and to bring them to the public's attention and to engage conversation about them. When there's a vacuum in leadership, when there's a failure of leaders to play that role, I have to assume it's deliberate, that they're actually satisfied with the status quo when they don't speak out about it. So it really starts with that, those acts of leadership, that willingness to engage conversations about uncomfortable topics. That's what a governor can do first and foremost. You start by setting a tone, and then you work to change policies and procedures and hold people accountable to those policies and procedures. But it has to start with a change in philosophy, from intimidate and control to protect and serve. And if we talk about that enough, if we engage enough conversations about that, we can get this moved in a better direction. But same thing with the economy. If we don't talk about the fact that we've got an approach that is all about feeding the rich and trying to build a sturdy economy from the top down, and if we don't challenge people to think about the benefits of doing it instead from the bottom up and empowering regular working people and putting more money in the pockets of regular working people, if we don't engage that debate everywhere we are all around the state, then that's a failure of leadership, and it will result in more of the same. We will get more trickle-down economics. We've got to change the conversation. That's what election campaigns should be all about, is changing conversations and slowly but surely changing the way people think about what Wisconsin has the potential to be. Yes? How do you win a statewide election as a Democrat in a state that has become redder than it has been in a long time? I think it's important to remember that in the 1950s, during the McCarthy era, Democrats, first of all, the voters of Wisconsin were choosing Joe McCarthy as the United States Senator representing our state in Washington. Democrats held fewer seats in the legislature at that time than Democrats hold now. And by the 1960s, just a few years later, Democrats had taken control of state government. They controlled the legislature and the governor's office. So there have been moments in fairly recent history when the Democrats were more deeply in the minority than they are today. And in a few short years after that, controlled the state. Gaylord Nelson, the father of Earth Day, was elected governor, and Democrats took control of the legislature. So Wisconsin has a history of being not a red state or a blue state, but really a purple state, a state that can go both ways and that will shift. We've shown ourselves to have something of a split personality over the course of years. And I think what's happening now in Wisconsin is that people have for a number of years favored Republicans, but they are dissatisfied with conditions in the state. What I encounter everywhere I go is a tremendous hunger for change. People are starving for a very different kind of leadership. And so I think the coalition is an urban-rural alliance. What the Republicans in recent years have been able to put together is a suburban-rural alliance, leaving Democrats as really only an urban party. And I remember a time in my childhood when areas like where I grew up were voting solidly Democratic. We're represented by Democrats. It is possible to recreate an urban-rural alliance in this state. And there are suburban areas that are also showing signs of moving a little bit away from Republican politics as well. So there's a tremendous opportunity here. I think there are two ways that Scott Walker will not be beaten, however. Walker will not be beaten with money. He will have vastly more than anyone. If you are looking for your Goliath, if you're looking for the candidate with the most money, I can tell you that no candidate in the Democratic field came close to raising even a tenth of what Scott Walker got done raising in 2017. All of us combined didn't raise a third. We will not beat him with money. He will have vastly more than anyone. We need to do this with people power. We have gone around this state. We got 2,100 volunteers now across Wisconsin. We're trying to build that citizen army that can neighbor by neighbor, neighbor to neighbor, we can get a message out to people. The other way we will not beat Scott Walker is by simply reminding voters over and over again what's wrong with Scott Walker. 3 times there have been not Walker campaigns run where the focus has been what's wrong with Scott Walker. We've got to be for something. We have got to make Wisconsin voters an offer about what this state has the potential to be and how we reach that potential. I think if we do that, if we are for an inspiring and provocative agenda for Wisconsin's future, and we rely on people power and don't fall into the trap of playing into his hands by trying to beat him with his greatest strength, he'll have overwhelmingly more money. If we do that, he can be had. He is very vulnerable in this election, and this state can be turned in a new direction. Talking to all the people I talk to around the state, I have no doubt about that. People are incredibly hungry for a very different kind of leadership. We need to offer them that different kind of leadership.
What do you think of $100 refund to families for school supplies? And then also the general topic of education.
I think so many of the recent steps taken by the governor are actually just clear indications that he is very nervous and very worried about his standing with the voters. And so he keeps trying to make new symbolic gestures or new offers of one kind or another. He's gone in one direction for 7 years, and then all of a sudden in an election year, he wants to restore some of the education funding that he cut for so many years. But the reality is still, even after trying to restore some budget funding for education, I just saw numbers recently, Wisconsin's in the top 10 nationally in the states that have shrunk education funding the most. That's not a good top 10 list to be on. In the early years of the administration, Wisconsin was actually leading the nation in cuts to education. He added a little bit back, again, in hopes that people would forget the cuts that had been made in the past, but still we're in the top 10 nationally in shrinking our investment in public education. Not a good top 10 list to be on. He's done some about faces on health care, on education funding, on road funding, on manure spreading, on all kinds of stuff. He's now having some changes of heart because he's clearly worried. And I think that the issue you raised, the $100 tax rebate, there's just a classic example of an indication that he's worried, that he is frightened. And he should be, because people I talk to out there are really, really hungry for change. And you know, I think that change can be made to happen. We can't count on any blue wave naturally occurring. We've got to earn this. We've got to go out there and make people a far better offer than they've been made for a long time. We need to offer We need to give people an opportunity to feel really good about voting for a change, because heaven knows so many people have felt doomed to hold their nose and choose the lesser of evils. And I'll be darned if I'm going to settle for being the lesser of evil in this election.